Welcome back everybody to another episode of Direct Comparison. In today's episode, we're going to take a look at the recently released World War II tactical shooter Hell Let Loose, and see how it compares visually to last year's Scriptum. For this comparison, both titles are being played on the PC platform, with the settings pushed to their highest values at a 1440p resolution. But for the sake of image clarity, any motion blur related settings will be disabled. Alright, so to kick this comparison off, let's start by taking a look at a few of the weapons shared between both games, starting with the classic M1911 pistol. Now the first thing I noticed when looking at these two side by side is that the coloration is slightly different. After looking at a few images of 1911s from this time period, it does appear like the darker metal coloration in Scriptum is slightly more authentic. On the other hand, Scriptum does fail to include the textured surface along the rear end of the slide, something that does appear present in Hell Let Loose. When looking at the weapon's firing animations, there also appears to be an error in Hell Let Loose, with the bullet casing being released from the weapon prior to the ejection port being opened, an issue not found in Scriptum. Next, let's look at the M1 Garand. Here we can clearly see high-resolution textures on the rifle in Scriptum, with the various notches and scratches along the sight appearing less blurry. However, at the same time, the soldier's arm holding the weapon appears more detailed in Hell Let Loose, even if both characters are technically wearing a different uniform here. One very interesting omission from Scriptum is the classic M1 Garand pinging sound after ejecting the end block clip, probably one of the most iconic sounds in any World War II video game. This sound can be heard throughout the game from other players using the weapon, but the sound never seems to trigger from the player's own rifle. I even noticed that the frames where the clip is supposed to pop out during the firing animation appears to be missing, with the bolt suddenly appearing in the retracted position and no sign of the ejected clip itself. Hell Let Loose, on the other hand, doesn't suffer from this problem, and appears to ping as expected. But Hell Let Loose isn't off the hook here, because if you look very closely at the manufacturer of the weapon itself, you can see that Black Matter have made a pretty crucial mistake. After doing a little bit of light research into the manufacturers, it appears that the most common M1 Garand during most of World War II was made by the Springfield Armory, which is properly shown in Scriptum. However, Hell Let Loose appears to be basing their Garand model off of a line of rifles created after World War II by International Harvester, a private manufacturer that was contracted to mass produce these rifles prior to the Korean War. Finally, let's look at the Germans' Kar 98 bolt-action rifle. Unlike the Garand, the textures for this rifle appear more crisp in Hell Let Loose, though the actual rifling mechanism does appear a tiny bit more detailed in Scriptum. In fact, if you slow down the animation, you can see another crucial error in Hell Let Loose, as the rounds fail to chamber properly after pulling the bolt back. Despite this, Hell Let Loose does have slightly more detailed textures for the character's hands and fingers. Moving on, let's look at the environments. For the most part, the environments in both games appear very similar, with large open green fields broken up by rows of tall hedges and sporadic trees. Though, if we take a close look at the textures that make up these environments, Hell Let Loose has much more impressive details all throughout. Not only do the textures look sharper, but Hell Let Loose also features more grass sprites and much more detailed trees and bushes. In the more urban environments, Hell Let Loose features more impressive interiors to the structures in each level, with abandoned furniture and other props lining the shelves and walls. Scriptum's interiors are typically empty, giving the urban combat experience a more sandbox feel. In Scriptum's defense, the environments themselves are much larger, and feature far more structures to explore than the limited size of the environments in Hell Let Loose. Though, I'd say the smaller size of Hell Let Loose seems to benefit the gameplay more, providing less needless running from point to point, and slightly more action on average. Next, let's look at the lighting. Lighting in Scriptum is much more advanced than the lighting in Hell Let Loose. Global illumination is present in both titles, but the lighting in Scriptum is more dynamic, with changing times of day on some maps and randomized weather effects to really help provide a unique experience every time you play. God rays pour through the trees and interact with the player's weapon model in a way that's simply not possible in Hell Let Loose. Unfortunately, I was not able to get the time of day to match in both games, especially considering Scriptum doesn't allow for any way to create a custom match without buying an entire server. But it's still pretty clear that the lighting effects both outside and inside structures are more advanced than in Hell Let Loose. Well, what about shadows? Shadows in both games actually look pretty decent, with soft projections and real-time shadows from things like trees. However, Scriptum is the only one here that properly casts a player shadow. To make up for this, Hell Let Loose does have a neat rolling cloud shadow effect that really helps make the environment feel more alive. If you look out across fields, you can see shadows slowly moving across the grass realistically. These shadows aren't necessarily being projected by actual cloud coverage, but it's a cool effect either way. Next, let's take a look at a few special effects, starting with a simple frag grenade. Unlike most first-person shooter games, the grenades in Scriptum and Hell Let Loose appear much more realistic, with less of a giant epic fireball and a heavier focus on widespread shrapnel. While shrapnel is visible in both games, it's even more noticeable in Scriptum, with what looks like tiny yellow particles flying in every direction that really helps to demonstrate the range of these devices. After the initial explosion, there's also a medium-sized cloud of dirt and smoke near the center that I think looks a bit more realistic in Scriptum, thanks to the way the wind seems to carry the smoke away. When looking at the smoke grenades, this becomes even more apparent, as smoke seems to realistically release from the canister over time, and the wind seems to create openings through the smoke that makes it less practical from a gameplay perspective. Hell Let Loose's smoke grenades still release somewhat realistically, but the resulting cloud of smoke is much more dense, and seems to reflect the light significantly more, creating a wall of white smoke, perfect for sneaking past enemies. It does seem a bit excessive, especially when you get close to it, but it's at least more practical to use. And then of course there's the tank explosions, which appear much more impressive in Scriptum than they do in Hell Let Loose. Hell Let Loose still has some nice explosive effects, but they feel a bit less dynamic, with smoke and fire just radiating around the point of the explosion evenly. Though granted, it is harder to get a close-up due to the black and white filter used when near an explosion of this magnitude. Finally, let's listen to a few sound comparisons. Which game do you think has the better overall sound design? And that wraps up this episode of Direct Comparison. Overall, these two games appear to be pretty evenly matched. Many of the environmental textures, weapon models, and details feel more advanced in Hell Let Loose than they do in Scriptum. Though Scriptum does do a few other things better, like a few more accurate weapon models, far better lighting effects, more realistic shadowing, and a few nice control options like the ability to look around without needing to change the character's movement direction. So it really just boils down to personal preference. But what do you guys think? Does Hell Let Loose look better or worse than Scriptum? Let me know in the comments section, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos posted every week.